The afternoon sun in Guadalajara streamed through the kitchen window, painting stripes of golden light on my geraniums and the impeccably swept floor. At 78, my life had become a ritual of small pieces, of silent gestures that kept the memories locked away where they could no longer hurt me. The smell of freshly brewed coffee, the gentle weight of knitting in my hands, the distant sound of children playing in the street. Every detail was a brick in the wall I had built around the past. My granddaughter, Sophia, sitting at the wooden table, was the only light from the present that I allowed in without restriction. At 16, she had an energy that filled the house, a curiosity that I admired and feared in equal measure. She was focused on her school assignment, a large piece of poster board where she was drawing the branches of a tree, our family tree. I watched her nimble fingers, the way her forehead wrinkled in concentration, and a knot formed in my throat. I knew the question was coming. It was inevitable. She had already filled in her mother's name, Elena, my name, and the names of her father's parents, but one main branch, the one that should have sprung from me, was dangerously empty. She looked up, and the innocence in her eyes was a sharp knife. "Grandma," she began, her voice soft, disarmed of any malice. "You never talk about my grandfather, my mother's father. We don't even have photos of him. Why did you get pregnant and he never married you? Didn't people judge you back then?" The air grew thick, heavy. The coffee cup in my hand trembled, the cold porcelain against my suddenly icy fingers. 60 years. For 60 years, that question had lived like a ghost in my house, a shadow in the corners of the rooms, an invisible weight on my stooped back. I had felt it in the pitying gazes of the villagers, in the silent hostility of my own daughter, Elena, who grew up with the fabricated story of a lost love, a good man taken by fate. But to hear the question there, so pure and direct, from my granddaughter's lips, broke something inside me. The dam of silence, built with decades of shame, pain, and a fierce protective instinct, began to crack. The face of Arturo, my father, appeared in my mind, not as the pillar of the community that everyone saw, but with the cold, controlling gaze that only I knew. The memory of that night, the eve of my wedding, an act of cruelty that destroyed not only my innocence, but the very fabric of my soul, returned with overwhelming force. I looked at Sophia, at her honest search for identity, and I saw myself, the young girl full of dreams that I once was. I realized, with a clarity that ached, that my silence had protected no one. It had only created a hole, an open wound that continued to be passed down from generation to generation. My silence was a poison, not a shield. For Sophia to be able to draw the branches of her tree on solid ground, I would have to unearth the rotten root I had hidden for so long. And there, with Sophia's notebook open on the table like a blank testament, I made the decision I had postponed for a lifetime. The truth, however monstrous, would be told. My silence would not be my granddaughter's tomb. My decision, once made, hung in the air between Sophia and me like an entity of its own, heavy and palpable. The sound of my own breathing became a roar in my ears, drowning out the ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall, a sound that for decades had been the soundtrack to my peaceful solitude. Now, each tick was one less beat in the time I had left to maintain control. Sophia, with the sharp intuition of youth, sensed the seismic shift that had occurred within me. Her face, once lit with curiosity, was now veiled with a confused concern. She put down her pen slowly, the sound of the plastic against the wooden table sounding like an explosion in the dense silence. "Grandma? Are you okay? You've gone pale." Her voice was both a balm and a torment. I wanted to wrap her in my arms and tell her that everything would be fine, but the lies were over. The truth was not something that would bring well-being, at least not at first. It was surgery without anesthesia, necessary to remove a tumor I had allowed to grow for 60 years. I forced my hands to stop trembling, placing the coffee cup on its saucer with a sharp, definitive clink. The dark, cold liquid looked like a well of secrets. I took a deep breath, the air seeming not to reach my lungs. I looked at my granddaughter's face, a mirror of my own lost youth, and I knew I couldn't spill that poison on her all at once. Or alone. She deserved the truth, but her mother, my daughter Elena, needed to be present. She was the bridge between my painful past and Sophia's future. I gathered what little strength I had left and forced a smile, though I felt my lips might crack. "I'm fine, my dear. I just remembered something important. Something I need to talk to you and your mother about." I stood up, feeling the weight of every one of my 78 years in my bones. I went to her and placed my hand on hers. "Can you come back tonight? After dinner? Bring your mother. It's important that the three of us are together to complete this tree." The word complete came out with tremendous effort, for what I was about to do was, in fact, break the main branch so that a new, stronger, and truer one could grow in its place. The time that followed Sophia's departure was a torturous vacuum. The house, once my safe refuge, suddenly became an echo chamber for my anxieties. Every shadow that lengthened on the floor as the afternoon wore on seemed like a physical manifestation of my fears. I knew I had to call Elena, but the simple act of walking to the old telephone on the living room side table felt like a journey of miles. The black, heavy device with its coiled cord was a relic from another era, just like the secret I kept. My hand hovered over the rotary dial for a long moment. Calling Elena was never a simple task. My daughter, my only beloved child, loved me in her own way. A practical, hurried, and often impatient way. To her, I was a figure from the past, an old woman with little quirks and insignificant dramas, someone to be cared for with a somewhat distant efficiency. She had no time for the nuances of my loneliness, or for the unspoken pains she saw only as senility. How could I expect her to have time for a truth that would shake the foundations of her own identity? I could hear her voice in my head before I even dialed. "Mama, what is it now? I'm in the middle of 1,000 things." I took a deep breath and turned the dial, number by number, the dragging mechanical sound filling the silence of the room. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring was a hammer blow to my chest. "Hello?" Elena's voice came through, exactly as I had predicted. Tired, on the verge of irritation. "Elena, my daughter. It's me." "Yes, Mama, I know. Did something happen? Is everything all right?" The concern in her voice was superficial, a formality. "I need you to come here tonight. After dinner." There was a pause, and I could picture her perfectly. Eyes rolling, a hand on her forehead, a deep sigh of exhaustion. "Tonight? Mama, that's impossible. I have a report to finish and—" "Please, Elena," I interrupted, and the tone of my voice, a mixture of pleading and an authority I rarely used, must have surprised her. "Bring Sophia with you. It's about the family. It's about the father you never knew." The silence on the other end of the line was different this time. It wasn't impatience, but a cold suspicion. "This story again, Mama? What's gotten into you today?" Before she could say more, I said the only thing I could. "Just come, please." And I hung up, my hands trembling uncontrollably, knowing I had just lit the fuse of a bomb. Night fell over Guadalajara like a heavy, dark cloak. I turned on only one lamp in the living room, leaving the corners in shadow, a reflection of the state of my soul. I didn't prepare coffee or cookies. The occasion did not call for hospitality, but for the rawness of the truth. When the doorbell rang, my heart leaped so violently I had to lean against the wall for a moment. I opened the door and there they were. Sophia, with an apprehensive look, searching my eyes for reassurance, and Elena, her face set, a mask of annoyance and filial duty. She walked in without giving me a kiss on the cheek, her usual mechanical greeting. Instead, she threw her purse on the sofa and crossed her arms, surveying the room with the air of someone about to deal with an irritating problem. "So, Mama, what's the big emergency? Sophia told me you suddenly went pale. Is your blood pressure high again? Did you take your medicine?" Every word was a small humiliation, a way of infantilizing me, of reducing the upheaval of my life to a mere medical symptom. She saw me not as the matriarch of her family, but as a burden, a set of problems to be managed. It was the first and most painful of the humiliations of that night, to be completely invalidated by the daughter to whom I had dedicated every breath of my existence. "It's not my pressure, Elena," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. I sat in my usual armchair, the only place in the house that still felt like mine. Sophia sat cautiously on the edge of the sofa, while Elena remained standing, a prosecutor ready to interrogate an unreliable witness. "You made me drive across town on a weeknight, Mama. I hope this is important." "It is," I replied, looking directly at her, trying to pierce the wall of impatience she had built around herself. "It's the most important thing I will ever tell you." Elena let out a short, humorless laugh. "Great. Another story from the village? Did the neighbor steal your chickens again? Or maybe you've decided the ghost of my father came to visit you." She turned to Sophia, as if to share an inside joke about her grandmother's senility. "Your grandmother has a vivid imagination, dear." And there, in that instant, being treated like a crazy woman, a burden, in front of my granddaughter, the pain solidified into a cold determination. The humiliation burned, but it also forged armor around my heart. I let her exhaust her sarcasm. I waited for the condescending smile to fade from her face as the silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable for her. For the first time, she seemed to notice that something was different about me. My usual passivity, my tendency to retreat in the face of her irritation, wasn't there. In its place was an unshakable stillness, a gravity she could no longer ignore or dismiss as a symptom. Her arms slowly uncrossed. "What is it, Mama? Just say it." The impatience was still there, but now there was a crack of uncertainty in her voice. I didn't rush. I looked at my hands, at the prominent veins and age spots that told the story of a life of work and silent sacrifice, the story she had never bothered to read. "Everything I told you about your father," I began, my voice low but clear, "was a lie. Not a complete lie, but the worst part of it, an omission." Elena frowned, confusion turning into defensive anger. "A lie? What do you mean?" "You told me he was a good man, a worker who traveled a lot and died far away. You told me you loved each other." "We didn't love each other," I said, and the simplicity of those 5 words seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Elena's expression hardened. "So what? You made it all up? Why? To play the victim? To have a sad story to tell?" The accusation hit me like a slap. The idea that I, who had spent my entire life swallowing my pain to protect her, could be accused of inventing suffering for attention was the final cruelty. Sophia looked from one to the other, her eyes wide, the family tree notebook forgotten in her lap, now looking like an artifact from an age of innocence that had just ended. "Do you think I would invent this, Elena? Do you really know me so little?" My daughter looked away, perhaps from a flash of shame. "I don't know what to think, Mama. You get stranger and stranger. You talk to yourself. You forget things. Now you come up with this." She stopped, not wanting to finish the sentence, but I finished it for her in my mind. "Now you come up with this, saying that the story that sustained me for 59 years is a sham." I knew words wouldn't be enough. She needed to see. She needed to touch the proof of my pain. With an effort that seemed to drain all my energy, I stood up and walked to my bedroom. She didn't follow, but I felt her eyes and Sophia's on my back. I returned to the living room holding a small, dark wooden box, worn by time, and the touch of my own hands over decades. I held it out to her, a sacred and profane object. "I never told you who he really was," I said, my voice choked but steady. "I have kept this for all these years. And what's inside here, Elena, will change everything you think you know about me, about yourself, and about the man whose blood runs in your veins." The small wooden box in my hands wasn't heavy, but it seemed to hold the weight of a lifetime. Elena's gaze, a mixture of anger, confusion, and a pain she didn't yet understand, was a mirror of the turmoil brewing inside me. As I touched the smooth, worn wood, the walls of my small house in Guadalajara dissolved, and the smell of dust and Damp earth from my village in Jalisco in the 60s filled my lungs. I was transported back, not to the 78-year-old Alma, but to the 18-year-old girl I once was, a girl whose dreams were as simple as they were bright. I saw myself, with my long, dark braids, sitting in the coolness of the porch, embroidering linen flowers for my wedding trousseau. The village air was thick, heavy with the sound of church bells, the smell of corn tortillas on the fire, and above all, with the weight of watchful eyes. Everyone knew everyone else's life. A family's honor was a fragile treasure, and a woman's, even more so, a crystal that could shatter with a whisper. My fiancé Mateo was a good boy, with hands calloused from working in the fields and a smile that seemed to promise a world of kindness. Our love was a quiet thing, built on stolen glances in the plaza after Mass and notes passed by his younger sister. For me, Mateo was not just a husband. He was a promise of escape. An escape from the house where I lived, a house governed not by affection, but by the relentless authority of my father, Arturo. I dreamed of a small house, with my own flowers in the window, and a silence that was of peace, not fear. Every stitch I made in the fabric of my trousseau was a step towards that freedom, a silent prayer that my life would finally begin. I didn't know then that some fathers don't see their daughters as flowers to be cultivated, but as possessions to be guarded under lock and key, and that my freedom was the last thing he would allow. My father, Arturo, was a pillar of our community. To the outside world, he was the personification of righteousness, a man of few words but firm actions, who contributed generously to the church and whose name was synonymous with respect and order. His posture was always erect, his clothes impeccable, even under the punishing Jalisco sun. But within the walls of our home, the respect he commanded on the street transformed into a suffocating control. His authority didn't need shouting. It was exercised through an icy gaze that could silence any conversation, a wave of his hand that dismissed my mother's opinion, or the way he inspected my embroidery, searching for flaws with an intensity that turned an act of love into a test of obedience. The first major public humiliation I suffered at his hands occurred on the night Mateo and his parents came to our house to finalize the wedding arrangements. The living room was tidy, the coffee and sweet bread served. The atmosphere should have been one of celebration. However, my father turned the occasion into a tribunal. With a cruel calmness, he began to interrogate Mateo. Not about his love for me, but about his finances, about the title to his family's land, about his future prospects. A man must know how to provide, but more than that, he must know how to rule his house, my father said, looking not at Mateo, but at me. My daughter was raised with rigor. She is not a woman of her own will. Will you have a firm hand to ensure that her honor, which is my honor, remains intact? Each question was a stab at Mateo's dignity, and another chain around my neck. I watched my fiancé's face turn red, his confidence draining away under Arturo's calculated attack. I felt like a prize animal on display, my will completely erased from the equation. My mother tried to intervene with a nervous smile, saying, "Arturo, dear, they are young. They love each other." But he silenced her with a single look, a look that said, "This is a matter for men." That night, in front of the man I loved and his family, I was publicly reduced to an object, a possession whose value was measured by the future owner's ability to control me. The second humiliation came a few weeks before the wedding, and it was even more personal, more insidious. It happened at the town market, one of the few places where a slight sense of freedom was permitted. I was with my cousins, laughing at a silly joke, when a young man, the son of a merchant I barely knew, greeted me politely. "Good afternoon, Señorita Alma." I responded with the same courtesy, a good afternoon, and a nod. Nothing more. The entire interaction lasted no more than 10 seconds, but my father, who was on the other side of the square closing a deal, saw. His eyes locked on me, and the joy of the moment dissipated like smoke. That night, he confronted me not in the privacy of my room, but in the dining room, in front of my mother and younger siblings. He didn't shout. His voice was low, cutting, which made it even more terrifying. "Who was the young man you were talking to in the plaza?" "No one, Papa. Senor Rojas's son. He just greeted me." "And since when do you entertain young men in the street? Laughing like a hussy? Drawing attention to yourself?" he continued, each word calculated to shame me. "You carry my name, our family's name. One slip from you, a moment of lightness, of frivolity, and you stain us. All. A respectable woman is silent. She is discreet. She does not show off in the market." My mother tried to defend me. "Arturo, please, she's a girl. She meant no harm." "Silence, woman," he commanded, and my mother flinched. "It is because of you, because of your laxity, that I must be twice as vigilant." He turned to me, his cold gaze piercing my soul. "You are engaged. Your body, your reputation, your honor, they no longer belong to you. They belong to me until the day I hand them over to your husband. And I will deliver an intact, immaculate property. Do you understand me?" I just nodded, tears burning my eyes, unable to speak. The humiliation of being scolded like a disobedient child, of having my honor questioned for such an innocent act in front of my family, was crushing. There, I understood that to him, I was not a daughter to be loved, but a burden to be watched, a fragile object whose purity was the measure of his own worth as a man. The eve of my wedding arrived. The house was immersed in a feverish, joyful bustle. My aunts and cousins rushed back and forth with flowers and ribbons. The smell of food baking in the oven filled the air. Laughter and lively conversations echoed through the rooms. For everyone, it was a moment of pure happiness. For me, it was the gateway to my liberation. In less than 24 hours, I would be Mateo's wife. I would have my own home, my own life, far from the watchful eye and heavy hand of Arturo. I felt like a prisoner, counting the minutes to freedom. That night, after all the out-of-town guests had left, and the house finally began to quiet down, I went to my room. I was exhausted, but my heart was pounding with anxious excitement. My wedding dress, simple and white, made by my mother's hands, hung on the door, gleaming in the moonlight that streamed through the window. It was a symbol of all the purity and hope I felt. It was then that the door opened. It was my father. He said nothing, just came in and closed the door behind him. The air instantly turned cold. The joy I felt turned into a knot of dread in my throat. "Papa? What is it?" He walked slowly towards me, his face an indecipherable mask in the dim light. "You seem happy," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Happy to leave me." "That's not it," I muttered, taking a step back. "I will always be your daughter." "No," he said, stopping inches from me. "You are mine. You always have been. No other man has the right to possess what is mine." Terror paralyzed me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. His gaze was not that of a father, but of a predator. And in that room, in the silence of a house sleeping and dreaming of a celebration, in the place that should have been my sanctuary, he committed the final act of possession. He didn't just destroy my innocence, my honor, or my future with Mateo. He destroyed Alma herself. In an act of absolute cruelty and power, he took me for himself, asserting his dominion in the most vile and monstrous way, knowing that the code of honor he so often preached would silence me forever. The world broke into a million pieces. The girl who dreamed of flowers in the window died there, on the floor of her own room. My wedding day dawned with a brilliant sun that seemed to mock the darkness that had swallowed my soul. I hadn't slept. I lay there, motionless, feeling the filth in every pore of my skin, the sound of the monsters breathing in the next room. When my mother came in, smiling, to help me get dressed, the sight of the white dress brought on a wave of nausea so violent that I barely made it to the bathroom in time. The wedding, of course, did not happen. A sudden fever, an inexplicable illness. That was the story we told. The village whispered. Some spoke of nerves, others of a bad omen. Mateo was confused, hurt. My father, with a performance worthy of a saint, showed concern. making sure no one got too close. The shame of the canceled wedding was immense, but it was a shield that protected me from a truth 1,000 times worse. The weeks that followed were a blur of silence and apathy. I moved through the house like a ghost, my soul locked away somewhere deep inside me. Mateo tried to see me, but I refused. How could I look him in the eye? How could I allow his kindness to touch my filth? Then the horror took a new form. It began with fatigue, with a sensitivity to smells, and then the unmistakable nausea. At first I denied it. I attributed it to the trauma, to the stress. But my body, the body that had been betrayed, now betrayed me in a new way, telling a secret my mind refused to accept. I counted the days, the weeks, with a growing dread. My mother, oblivious to the cause, worried about my declining health. My father watched me from a distance with a look I couldn't decipher. Triumph? Guilt? It didn't matter. I was alone, completely alone with that seed of terror growing inside me. And one morning, as the sun rose, the certainty hit me, with the force of a physical blow, taking what little breath I had left. In the silence of my room, weeks after the wedding that never happened, the absence of my cycle and the persistent nausea brought me a truth more violent than the assault itself. The monster hadn't just destroyed my soul, he had planted his seed inside me. The past receded, returning me to the present with the force of a breaking wave. I was back in my living room, under the yellowish light of the single-lit lamp, with the small wooden box in my trembling hands. The air was charged, electric. Before me, my daughter Elena's face was a landscape of disbelief and fury. The story I had sown in her mind for nearly 60 years, a story of tragic romantic love, now lay in ruins, and she looked at me as if I were the arsonist who had set fire to her world. A seed, she repeated my last words from the past, her voice a hoarse whisper laced with contempt. Is that it, Mama? A new twist in your melodrama? What's in this box? Proof of your sick imagination? Her insults, which once would have wounded me deeply, now ricocheted off the armor of dignity that the pain itself had forged in me. The fear that had paralyzed me for my entire life was still there, a low hum in the back of my mind, but it was no longer in command. The protective love I felt for Sophia, and even the wounded love I felt for Elena, gave me a strength I didn't know I possessed. With a slow, deliberate movement that contrasted with the storm in my chest, I reached out and placed the box on the coffee table. The sound of wood against wood was the only sound in the room. It was an invitation and an ultimatum. "Open it," I said, my voice firm. Elena hesitated, her eyes fixed on the box as if it were a snake ready to strike. She looked at Sophia, who was huddled on the sofa with wide eyes, and then at me. She was looking for the weak woman she had always known, the mother who would back down, who would apologize, who would say it was all a mistake. But she didn't find me. In my place was a stranger, an old woman with a straight spine and a gaze that didn't waver. With an exasperated sigh, as if doing a favor for a madwoman, she leaned over and opened the rusty metal clasp. The lid opened with a soft creak, revealing an interior lined with a piece of faded velvet. Elena looked inside, and her expression of contempt faltered, giving way to a silent confusion. With 2 fingers, as if afraid to touch, she removed the first object. It was a single baby booty, knitted with a wool that had once been white but was now yellowed with age. It was so small, so delicate, a time capsule of a life that had barely begun. She held it in the palm of her hand, and for an instant, the hardness in her face dissolved. That small object was undeniably real, a bridge to a past she did not know. "What is this?" she asked, her voice lower, the aggression momentarily forgotten. "It's yours," I replied, and the simplicity of the answer made her look up at me. "It was the first shoe I knitted for you, night after night, hidden in my room. I was trying to make the pair, but it was hard to concentrate. My hands shook a lot back then. I wasn't lying. My hands shook with dread, with shame, with the terror of carrying my own father's child. But by focusing on the act of creating something for her, I found a small island of purpose in an ocean of despair. It was an act of maternal love born from the deepest violation. I wanted her to feel that. I wanted her to remember that before any story, before any secret, there was my love for her, a love that survived the unthinkable. I loved you before you were even born, Elena, I continued, my voice breaking for the first time that night. I loved you more than I hated myself, more than I feared the world. This little shoe, it was my promise, the promise that I would live for you, no matter the cost. Elena said nothing. She just kept looking at the small object in her hand, and I saw the first tear of the night slide down her face and drip onto the yellowed wool. The first wall had fallen. Underneath the space where the booty had rested, there was another object, a piece of notebook paper, folded several times until it became a small, fragile square. It was stained, and the creases were so worn they looked like they were about to tear. With the hand that wasn't holding the booty, Elena picked it up. She unfolded it with a hesitant slowness, revealing faded handwriting, the lines tight, as if the writer wanted to hide the words even from the paper itself. "What is this?" she whispered, her gaze fixed on the words she couldn't yet process. "It's a letter," I said, taking a deep breath to maintain my composure. "A letter I wrote to the only person in the world who might one day understand me, myself. I wrote it a few weeks after everything happened. I needed to put the truth somewhere outside of my head. I felt that if I didn't, the lie would consume me from the inside. I would go mad." Sophia, who had remained silent until then, leaned forward, her large eyes filled with an empathetic pain that broke my heart. She understood the gravity of that piece of paper. Elena, on the other hand, was still at war with herself. Her mind, forged by decades of a simple and comforting narrative, refused to accept the monstrous complexity unfolding before her. "You want me to read this?" she asked, and in her voice there was a genuine fear, the fear that those words had the power to destroy everything she was. "I need you to read it," I replied. "I've spent 60 years carrying this story alone. I'm tired, my daughter. I'm so very tired. You need to know who you are. And for that, you need to know who I was." Slowly, as if the letter burned her fingers, she raised it. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence before a storm, the silence of a courtroom before the verdict. The fate of our family, of 3 generations of women, was contained in that single sheet of yellowed paper. I couldn't look away from my daughter's face as she read. Every emotion that crossed her eyes was a stab in my own heart. First, confusion, as she tried to decipher my trembling 18-year-old handwriting. Then, a furrowed brow, disbelief, as the first sentences described the night before a wedding that never happened. I saw her lips move, silently reading the words that described the terror, the paralysis, the violation. The color began to drain from her face, leaving her a deathly pale. Her breathing became shallow, almost inaudible. I watched her read about my loneliness, about the fear of being pregnant, about the devastating certainty that followed, and then, the moment I had both dreaded and longed for. I saw her eyes reach the part of the letter where I named my attacker, where I wrote his name so that I would never forget, so that the fog of trauma would not allow me to rewrite the story with a softer lie. I saw the shock in her eyes, a shock so deep, so visceral, that she physically recoiled, as if she had been punched. The hand holding the letter trembled violently. A single tear, which she tried to hold back, escaped and traced a slow path down her cheek, falling onto the paper and smudging the 60-year-old ink. She looked up at me, and what I saw in her eyes was the image of an entire world breaking apart. The anger was gone. The impatience was gone. In its place was pure horror and a pain so deep it seemed ancient. The pain of a truth that had just been born for her, but that I had carried since before her birth. In that moment, she was no longer the busy, impatient executive. She was just a girl whose origin story had been revealed to be a nightmare. "No," was the only word she could manage. A broken, denial-filled whisper. "It can't be. Mama, no. She shook her head, her hair falling across her face, as if she could deny reality. Not him. Grandpa Arturo? The way she said his name, with the familiarity of a grandchild, with the reverence I myself had taught her, was like twisting a knife in an open wound. She crumpled the letter in her hand, the paper protesting with a tearing sound. This is a lie. A horrible lie. You're sick, Mama. He was a good man, a man of God. He gave me candy when I was little. He was my grandfather. Her voice rose, bordering on hysteria. The pain was turning back into anger, a last, desperate defense against the monstrous truth. It was then that the strength I had been gathering finally found its voice. I stood up and walked to her, stopping in front of her. He hid behind God, Elena, I said, my voice hard, but not cruel. He used the Bible to justify his control, and the town's respect to hide his rottenness. The man who gave you candy was the same man who stole my life. He wasn't just my father. He was my jailer. And the night he did that, he wasn't punishing me. He was marking me as his property forever. I looked deep into her eyes, forcing her to see. You are not the fruit of a lost love, my daughter. You are the fruit of his violence. I am not a victim who invents stories for attention. I am the survivor of his crime. And you are my reason for having survived. The words hit her with the force of a hurricane. The anger in her eyes finally broke, and the dam of pain burst. A deep, guttural sob escaped her lips, the sound of a lifetime of certainties crumbling to dust. The sound of Elena's weeping filled the room. It was an adult's cry, but with the helplessness of a child. She bent forward, her body racked with spasms of grief, her face buried in her hands. The crumpled letter fell to the floor, forgotten. In that moment, her entire world, her identity, the romanticized memory of an absent father and a respected grandfather, had all been reduced to ashes. Sophia, who had watched everything in terrified silence, finally moved. With a maturity that belied her 16 years, she stood up, went to her mother, and wrapped her in a hug. She said nothing, just held her mother as she cried, casting a look at me over Elena's shoulder, a look that was a mixture of pain, understanding, and an unshakable love. Seeing the two of them together, my pain and theirs merged. I knelt in front of Elena, an act my old joints protested, and placed my hand on hers. I'm so sorry, my daughter, I whispered. I'm sorry I lied, and I'm even more sorry that this is our truth. Elena lifted her head, her face, swollen and red, her eyes searching mine. The anger was gone, the denial was gone. What remained was a raw vulnerability I hadn't seen since she was a little girl. You carried this alone? She asked between sobs. For all these years? Alone? I just nodded, the tears finally streaming down my own face. And then she did something she hadn't done in decades. She pulled away from Sophia and threw herself into my arms, hugging me with the force of someone drowning. The three of us stayed. There, on the floor of my small living room, a tangle of arms and tears, 3 generations of women united by a pain that had finally found its voice. That night, we mourned the death of a lie that had kept us apart. But as I held my daughter and my granddaughter, I knew that grief would not be the end. The truth, once freed, is not content with tears. It demands justice. It demands change. And in the quiet that followed the storm, as the sun began to rise outside, a new resolution formed in my heart. A resolution that would leave behind the woman who suffered in silence forever. The first light of the next morning came through the window, not as an intruder, but as a silent witness to our vigil. The smell of fresh coffee I was brewing in the kitchen was an aroma of normality in a world that had been turned upside down. There was nothing left to be said about the night before. The truth lay on the table, exhausted and naked, between the three of us. Elena sat at the table, her eyes swollen, stirring a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. Sophia was by her side, her hand resting on her mother's arm, a gesture of support that was both fierce and tender. The silence was no longer one of secrets, but of processing, of mourning a past that never existed, and of uncertainty about the future. It was in this silence that my resolution, forged in the darkness of the night, found its voice. I placed a cup of coffee in front of Elena and sat down. "I'm going to sell the house," I said, simply. Elena looked up, confusion clouding her pain. "What house, Mama?" "The house in the village, my parents' house." The mention of that property, which loomed over our family like an untouched mausoleum, made Elena recoil. It was Arturo's inheritance, a place she had visited only a few times as a child, but which existed in her mind as a monument to her family's respectability. Sell it? Why? It's been in the family for generations. "Exactly," I replied, my voice calm but unwavering. "The generations of lies are over, Elena. That house is not a home. It's a tomb. It's the place where my soul was buried. I never had the courage to go back there, to get rid of it. I kept it out of a twisted sense of duty, as if I should honor the name of the man who destroyed me. But my duty is no longer to him. My duty is to you, to Sophia, to myself. We cannot build a new future on a rotten foundation. That place, and everything it represents, has to go. We need to pull up this root for the last time." The weight of my words hung over Elena. I saw a war of emotions in her eyes. The practical woman in her thought of the loss of an asset. The daughter loyal to a false memory felt betrayed. But the woman whose life had been unraveled as a painful lie was beginning to understand. She looked at her own hands, then at the baby booty that was still on the table, and finally at me. The wall of her anger and denial had turned into a field of ruins, and in their midst, a fragile new plant was beginning to grow. Empathy. "Mama," she began, her voice choked. "Forgive me. It was not an apology for the previous night, but for a lifetime of blindness. All the times I was impatient with you, all the times I rolled my eyes at your stories, all the times I made you feel like a burden. I didn't see. I never truly saw you." The tears welled up in her eyes again. But this time, they were not of shock, but of a deep, cleansing remorse. I was so busy defending the memory of a ghost, of a hero I invented, that I didn't see the real heroine sitting in front of me the whole time. I reached across the table and took her hand. Her skin was soft, unlike my rough hands, but the blood that ran through them was the same. "You couldn't have known, my daughter," I said with all the sincerity in my heart. "I built the wall that kept you from seeing. I gave you the story you believed. Protecting you was the only way I knew how to love you. I just didn't realize that my silence, the shield I gave you, was also a cage. Today, we are both free from it." In that moment, the dynamic between us changed forever. I was no longer the frail mother to be cared for, and she was no longer the impatient daughter. We were two women, two survivors, looking at each other across a shared truth, ready to rebuild our relationship brick by brick on the only foundation that matters: honesty. The decision to go to the village was made together. At first, I intended to go alone, to face my ghosts in private. But when I announced my plan, Elena and Sophia objected with a firmness that moved me. "No way are you going alone," Elena said, her voice filled with a new, protective authority. "We started this together. We'll finish it together." Sophia nodded in agreement, her eyes determined. "It's our story too, Grandma. We're going with you." And so, a few days later, the 3 generations of my family got into Elena's car and took the road I hadn't traveled in decades. The journey from Guadalajara to the countryside was a journey back in time. As the urban landscape gave way to fields of blue agave and small adobe towns, the memories came in waves. I saw the trees where I used to play, the river where I washed clothes with my mother, the hill from which I watched the sunset, dreaming of Mateo. They were sweet memories from a life that existed before the darkness, and I allowed myself to feel them without the stain of what came after. Elena drove in silence, but every now and then I would catch her looking at me in the rearview mirror, with an expression of someone trying to imagine the young woman I once was. Sophia, in the back seat, asked gentle questions about the towns we passed, about what life was like back then. They weren't questions about the trauma, but about life. She was trying to fill in the gaps, to reconstruct her grandmother's story, not as a victim, but as a whole person. With every mile, I felt the fear of what was to come diminish, replaced by a sense of quiet strength. I was not returning as the frightened girl who had fled, but as the matriarch of my family, with my daughter and granddaughter as my honor guard. We were going back not to be haunted by Arturo's ghost, but to evict him from his last fortress. Arriving in the village was like stepping into an old photograph. Little had changed. The central plaza, the church with its worn bells, the cobblestone streets. But I had changed. We parked the car in front of the house. It was there, exactly as I remembered it, but smaller, sadder. The paint on the walls was peeling, and weeds grew in the cracks of the sidewalk. It was the physical image of a secret left to rot. I took the old key from my pocket, the same key my father had once held, and the feel of the cold metal in my hand was a shock. For a moment, I hesitated. Elena placed her hand on my shoulder. "We're with you, Mama." I took a deep breath and turned the key in the lock. The door opened with a protesting creak, releasing a smell of mold and stopped time. We entered together. The light filtering through the dusty windows illuminated furniture covered in white sheets, which looked like little ghosts. Every object was a memory. The dining table where I was humiliated, the armchair where my father sat like a king. I walked slowly through the rooms, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the silence. Finally, I reached the door of my old bedroom. My heart was pounding. I pushed the door open and went inside. It was almost empty, except for an iron bed and a small vanity. The moonlight no longer streamed through the window to illuminate a wedding dress, but the harsh afternoon sun did. I stood there, in the center of the room, the epicenter of my pain, and I felt something I never expected to feel. Nothing. The power that room had over me was gone. It was no longer a place of horror. It was just an empty room in an old house. I was no longer a prisoner of those walls. I was the woman who had come to tear them down. That was my true moment of liberation. The exorcism was not performed with screams or tears, but with a calm, silent reclaiming of power. The news that Don Arturo's daughter was in town to sell the family home spread like wildfire. The next day, when we went to the small local notary's office to start the process, we found the notary, a younger man who was the son of the old notary, and a few curious onlookers pretending to have business to attend to. The air was heavy with unasked questions. The notary, a formal man, expressed his surprise. "Selling your parents' house, Doña Alma? Such an important property. Your father, God rest his soul, was such a respected man here, a pillar of our community." I felt Elena stiffen beside me, ready to defend my honor with a fury I had never seen in her, but I placed a hand on her arm to calm her. Revenge was not my path. Dignity was. I looked at the man, not with anger, but with a weary compassion. I would not stain the public square with the sordid details of my pain. That would forever belong to me, my daughter, and my granddaughter, but I would not perpetuate the lie either. "Sir," I began, my voice clear and firm, "my father had the life he had and the respect he earned, but for my family, that house does not hold good memories. It represents a past that has made us sick for a very long time." I paused, letting my words sink in. My daughter, my granddaughter, and I are building a different future now. A future based on honesty and emotional health. Keeping that house would be to betray everything we are building. Some inheritances, no matter how valuable they may seem, are too heavy to carry. I didn't accuse him. I didn't shout. I just stated my truth with an unshakable tranquility. The notary was speechless. The onlookers looked away, suddenly ashamed. In that silence, the immaculate reputation of Arturo, the pillar of the community, suffered its first and most profound crack. It was not demolished by a scandal, but eroded by the silent strength of a daughter's truth, who refused to carry the weight of his lie for one more day. We returned to Guadalajara not just with the money from the sale of the house, but with something infinitely more valuable, a shared purpose. One evening, sitting at the same kitchen table where the truth had exploded, the idea was born. It wasn't mine, nor Elena's, nor Sophia's, but all three of ours. The money would not be used to buy things, but to build something. We decided to create a small foundation, a place of refuge for women who, like me, had been silenced by violence within their own homes. It was as if a light had been switched on in the midst of the darkness we had traversed. Suddenly, our individual pain gained a greater meaning. Elena, with her experience in administration, dived into the paperwork, the legal aspects, with a passion I had never seen her demonstrate in her corporate job. Sophia, with the energy of her youth, began to research, to contact social workers, to create online networks, her idealism finally finding a real cause. And I, old Alma, became the heart of the project. I had no knowledge of laws or technology, but I had my story. I met with the first women who came to us, not as a counselor, but as an equal. I listened to their stories, and in doing so, I honored my own. We transformed the poison that had nearly destroyed our family into an antidote, offering others what I never had: a safe place to speak, a hand to hold, and the living proof that it is possible to survive and flourish. The contrast between appearance and essence had never been clearer to me. Arturo's legacy, built on the appearance of honor, resulted in pain and secrecy. Our new legacy, built on the essence of a painful truth, was creating healing and hope. The months that followed were of a slow, deep reconstruction. My relationship with Elena blossomed in a way I had never imagined possible. Our conversations became long, honest, filled with an affection that no longer needed to hide behind formalities or impatience. She would call me not out of obligation, but to share her day, to ask my opinion on the direction of our small foundation, to simply know how I was. Sophia became my accomplice, my partner. She would spend hours at my house, not to do a school assignment, but to listen to my stories, the good and the bad, filling in the branches of our family tree no longer with names and dates, but with the complexity of real life. My small house in Guadalajara, once a fortress that protected me from the world, was transformed into a center of operations for love and resilience. The silence that was once heavy with pain was now filled with laughter, with the sound of the phone ringing with news from the foundation, with the planning of our next step. I had spent most of my life believing that peace was the absence of conflict, silence at any cost. I was wrong. Peace is not silence. Peace is the ability to take a deep breath after the truth has been spoken, no matter how loud and chaotic it may be. For 60 years, I lived in a tidy house, but with a soul in disarray. Today, my life may seem more complicated to others, but for the first time, my soul is at peace. And that peace, no one can take from me anymore. 2 years passed. 2 years since the journey that unearthed a ghost and the night that drowned a lie. Time, which for so many decades was my enemy, a relentless guardian of my suffering, became my ally. It didn't erase the scars, but it gave them the soft patina of distance, transforming them from open wounds into lines that told a story of survival. Today, I was sitting in the front row of a community hall in the heart of Guadalajara. The place wasn't luxurious, but it was overflowing with something much more valuable: hope. The walls were decorated with drawings made by children and posters with words like courage, voice, and justice. It was the second anniversary of our Fundación Renacer, the Rebirth Foundation. The air vibrated with conversations, with laughter, and occasionally, with the silent cry of someone who felt seen for the first time. Looking at the audience, I saw dozens of women, each with her own story of silence. But today, they were not alone. I looked to my side and saw my daughter, Elena. The woman who once dressed in the impeccable suits of an executive now wore a simple dress and a smile that reached her eyes. She moved through the hall with a grace and warmth I had never seen her possess, hugging a woman here, offering a word of comfort there. She was no longer a manager of problems. She was a caretaker of souls. On the other side, my granddaughter Sophia, now an 18-year-old university student, was arranging pamphlets on a table. There was a new confidence in her posture, a clarity in her gaze. The curious girl who once asked about an empty branch on a family tree had helped cultivate an entire forest of support for others. I, at 80, felt the weight of age in my bones, but no longer in my soul. The invisible burden that had stooped my back had been lifted, not by forgetting, but by sharing. Elena went up to the small stage and, with a voice choked with emotion, called me to say a few words. As I walked slowly towards the microphone, leaning on a cane that was more of an accessory than a necessity, a warm and genuine applause filled the room. It was not applause for a victim, but for a fellow traveler. I stopped in front of the microphone and looked at the faces before me. For 60 years, my voice was trapped in my throat, silenced by fear and shame. Now, it had a place to go. "Good evening," I began, my voice a little shaky at first, but gaining strength with each word. When I'm asked to speak, I never quite know what to say. I am not an expert, nor an academic. I am just a woman who has lived a very long time. And the most important thing I've learned in all my years is that the heaviest secret is not the one we tell others, but the one we tell ourselves to survive. I didn't need to tell the details of my story. Many women in that room knew their own versions of violence and silence. We tell ourselves that silence protects our children, that it keeps the peace in the family, that shame is a burden we must carry alone. But silence is not peace. It is a disease that is passed from mother to daughter, that creates holes in our families where love should grow. The real healing, I continued, looking directly at Elena and Sophia, who were watching me with tears in their eyes, begins when we have the courage to break that secret, first to ourselves and then to someone we trust. The truth can hurt. Oh yes, it hurts. But it is a pain that cleanses. It is a pain that makes space for something new and honest to be born. When I finished, a deep silence fell over the room for an instant, a silence of recognition, before erupting into another round of applause, even stronger this time. And for the first time, I didn't flinch at the sound. I welcomed it, not as an award, but as the confirmation that my voice had finally found its home. After the event, as we were helping to put away the chairs, Sophia approached me, her eyes shining with passion. "Grandma, in my law class today, we studied human rights cases, specifically focused on protecting victims of domestic violence. The professor talked about how a change in the law often begins with the courage of a single person to tell their story, and I could only think of you." Her words were a gift greater than any material wealth. The seed that Arturo had planted with violence, I, with the help of my daughter and granddaughter, had transformed into a tree of justice that would continue to bear fruit long after I was gone. The legacy of pain had been broken. In its place, we had built a legacy of resilience. Later, back at home in the quiet of the night, I went to the mirror in my room. For decades, the woman who stared back at me was a stranger. I saw the contours of my face, the deepening wrinkles, but I didn't recognize the person behind the eyes. I saw the mask of the respectable widow, the silent mother, the harmless grandmother, an empty shell, shaped by the fear and the lie I myself had sustained. But that night, something was different. I looked at the lines around my eyes and saw the laughter I now shared with Elena. I looked at the softness around my lips and saw the smiles I exchanged with Sophia. I looked deep into my own eyes and, for the first time, I did not see the shadow of fear or the ghost of Arturo. I saw a tired woman. Yes, but a whole one. A woman who had walked through hell and chosen not to burn in it, but to use its flames to light the way for others. It took me 80 years to make peace with the person in the mirror. But today, finally, I saw the woman I had become. Leave a heart in the comments if you also believe that love is worth more than any wealth. Subscribe to the channel for more second chance stories. Comment, "Love has no price," if you also believe in human kindness.